This time we'll dismiss the kids to go to Kids Corner. It is good to see everybody today. I know everybody lost the hour, but I'm kind of glad you're here, and just hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week coming up. In the weeks leading up to Easter, we're going to be continuing to preach out of the Gospel of John. Rome was famous for not liking rivals. And even though they have a bad reputation, Rome actually valued peace above all other things. They have a reputation as being all the time violent. I'm not sure that's the case because, see, conflict is bad for business. And so they would strictly and ruthlessly remove anything or anyone that either sounded like a rival or looked like that they would upset the order and the established peace. So in order to maintain the order, I don't need to tell you, they would carry out executions. And the executions would be in a very public way. And the warning was plain. They would do it publicly. They would erect crosses and put people on the crosses. And the message was, if you go against Rome, this is what's going to happen to you. Thousands of people, probably tens of thousands of people, ended their lives on a Roman cross. One of those people was a Jewish speaker that attracted a following. He launched no attacks, he recruited no army, and never anywhere called for the overthrow of Rome. He did not seem to want to set up a rival government, yet he was killed anyway. And so when we go back and look at this life, the question is, why was he killed? Who was this Jesus? And why was he even viewed as a danger to Rome? I'm reading out of John chapter 5. Jesus is starting to answer these questions about who he is. And in chapter 5, starting with verse 16, so because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. And for this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And Jesus gave him this answer, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing. Because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. This is what you call a Trinitarian passage. If you want to dig in, which is what we won't be doing today. But when we start talking about this question, who exactly is this Jesus? And let me give his opponents, his enemies, a little support here. They were right. They heard what Jesus was saying, and they said, listen, this guy is claiming that he's equal to God the Father. And they were right. That is what Jesus is claiming. They heard the implication that Jesus was calling himself God. This was at the time a ridiculous and offensive claim. For a mere man to go around acting as if, claiming as if he is God. See, to them, God was powerful and enthroned above. God did not interact much with our world. One of the things that I've said before, in the book of John is the shortest verse in all of the Bible. John 10:35. I bet you know it. If you don't have any biblical verses memorized, I have one for you. Before you leave here today, you can have it memorized. In fact, before I'm done with this next paragraph, you can have it memorized. It's called Jesus Wept. That's not hard. And it used to be kind of a running joke in our house, because when I grew up, if Grandma came for dinner, and she just lived next door, so she was over for dinner quite a bit, and it didn't matter if you were a kid from the neighborhood, if you were at our house for dinner, you couldn't get up from the table. Remember the old days when you had to ask to be excused? When you couldn't wear a baseball hat or any other hat at the table? Just try coming to eat with a tank top on, see how that went. All those old things. And you would say, "May I be excused, please?" And Grandma would say, "After you recite a memory verse." And so very quickly, "Jesus wept," and we'd jump up. And she would then say, after that, the next time, you have to recite a memory verse, and it can't be "Jesus wept." And then she thought and said, and it can't be "pray continually" out of Corinthians either. And so it almost got to be a joke, this Jesus wept thing. And I don't think we understand that little tiny verse is as powerful as it actually is. In that world, if you were Greek, if you were Gentile from the Roman Empire, well, you knew who your gods were. You're familiar with some of them. Aphrodite and Diana and Zeus and Hercules and all of these names. And these gods lived on Mount Olympus, and they cavorted with each other. They didn't mix with humanity at all, and they didn't really have interaction or cared anything about how you lived. And if you were Jewish, God was the creator. God was the builder of the world. God was the one who sent the flood. God was separated from us, the heavens as opposed to the earth. But in that little verse, Jesus wept, this is a completely different picture of God. This is a God that is involved and is moved when we are moved. A God who is involved with us and cares what happens to us and in our lives. If Jesus is right here, and if Jesus is God, as he's claiming in John chapter 5, then God is not distant, and is not uninvolved, and is not uncaring, and knows this actually quite well. And the biggest challenge to them, if Jesus was God, is God, then what they think is wrong. And there's now a threat to their authority. And maybe that threat must be eliminated. Right after Jesus said these things, it says they sought all the more to kill him. Now let me also fast forward to 2023, the world in which we live. This is the problematic part of Christianity. This is the problematic. This is where Jesus would do well to hire a New York consulting advertising firm to do a little better with the messaging, maybe to rebrand a little bit, to soften the message around the corners, because Jesus here is making a very exclusive claim. He says, "I'm God." One of the troubles is you read the Gospels, you can't get around this basic claim that Jesus very much saw himself as being God. Jesus goes through this, and he also says how he gives life. Verse 21, just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. We have it pretty good most of the time. A lot of us, when we sing that song we sang this morning, "All my life you have been faithful, you have been so, so good," which I think is true, but it's very tangible for a lot of us. if you go back through history, if you look at the entirety of history, and you would say, gee, when would I want to be born? And where would I like to be born in all of human history? Probably almost everyone would choose around now and in the West somewhere. And for good reason. We think this is normal. We think that somehow we created these good circumstances. One of the frustrating parts for me when I look at what's going on is I see some people saying some things about how awful it is now, and they shout and they're angry and they get in people's faces, and I'm not saying there might not ever be a time for something like that, but really, look at all the sweep of human history. This is what you think is evil and bad. I heard just this week that there was, at a big gathering, they found out that someone who was at this gathering had measles. And I thought, oh, people still get measles? I mean, it's been so long. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when a lot of the kids in the neighborhood kind of got measles. And it just kind of brought me up short. I didn't know that still happened. We have it good. But many people live surrounded by lifeless circumstances. Like we talked last week, the thing that Jesus brings is not even morality or right versus wrong. He brings life, and that's how he describes it again here in John 5. Because most of the time we're surrounded by death. Death that's naturally out there, and death that we bring on ourselves through selfishness and greed and anger and pride and all those things that limit and narrow life. Jesus made this strange claim here. Just as the Father raises the dead, so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. This is a very strange claim. I believe in a God that raises the dead, yet if I were at a funeral and saw the person of honor sit upright in the middle of the service, it would be disconcerting. This is before Lazarus. We'll go on later in John, and we see Jesus bring Lazarus to life. In another gospel, he brings an official's daughter to life. And then, after his death on the cross, Jesus is raised from the dead. This is the exclusive claim of Christianity. Again, tens of thousands of people died on a Roman cross. Only one was resurrected. And now we live in a world, and I'm going to go through this in case someone wanders by this on the internet this week. Is there any proof for Jesus rising from the dead? Certainly, this is just a story that was concocted by his followers because they couldn't deal with his death, or they wanted to start a rival movement and gain power themselves. There's a lot of different ways that this claim takes. And my answer is, oh my goodness, yes, there's proof. There are multiple eyewitness accounts. And when you say Bible, that's not really accurate. You have the writer of Mark, 1. You have the writer of Matthew, that's 2. The writer of Luke, that's 3. You have the writer of John, that's 4. You have another document, this might mean to some of you, that a lot of the Gospels are based on, called Q, that's 5. You have Paul, that's 6. You have this independent James that he writes the letter to James, that's 7. The person who writes 1 Peter, that's 8. So you have these 8 that all make the same surprising claim. They also say, well, over time this thing developed. No, we have it right away. We have evidence that right away you have these people all saying the exact same message, not years later, months later. When Paul writes Philippians chapter 2, Your attitude should be the same as Christ Jesus. Jesus, though he was God, did not cling to his rights as God, but laid aside his mighty power. That was a hymn that the early Christians sang years before Paul wrote, and Paul's only writing about 30 years later. Also, you have non-biblical sources. Eusebius, Josephus, Philo. Not that I'm counting, I think I'm up to 11. And by the way, let's pretend they're right for a second. Let's pretend the rival opinion is right. These are people, they wanted to keep this going, so they needed to find a Messiah to put all their weight behind it, and they can continue this rival movement. Let's pretend that that's true, that this is what they're after. Jesus would have been the last person to attach his name to this movement. He fulfilled nothing of the expectations for the Messiah. He never set up a government. He overthrew no one. He tried to overthrow no one. And he was crucified on a cross. In Deuteronomy 23, cursed is the one who is hung on a tree. This is not the person you would ever select. In the terms of first century Messiah, Jesus was a flop. One of the reasons why Paul says this foolishness of preaching. What would it have taken to attach any of this to a Jesus? Well, you'd have to be something so odd and strange, it would be, like someone rising from the dead. And then the powers that be moved in and said, by the way, you're going to stop doing this or we're going to end your life. And none of them did. And they said, okay. See, we can't stop because it's not a story. We're just telling you what we've seen and heard. And we can't stop telling you the reality of what life is for us. There was no expectation at the time for someone to rise from the dead. And when confronted and challenged and threatened with death, they did not change their story. Some of you are very familiar with a man named Chuck Colson. For those of you under a certain age, those of you under the age of about 40, 45, Chuck Colson was part of Nixon's advisors. He was part of the Watergate break-in, and more so than that, the Watergate cover-up. And Chuck Colson said, here's how I knew Jesus was true. He said, I was part of this Watergate cover-up. When threatened with prosecution, our story lasted about 3 weeks. And then it all started to unravel. Disciples, 12 men threatened with death, and they took it to their grave. If Jesus did rise from the dead, then everything has changed. Everything has changed. Our expectations have changed. The way we tell time has changed. The way we judge our life changes. The way we consider who we are changes. It is not a tragedy if I never, ever, ever go on my dream vacation, because my best days are yet to come. And by the way, if what Jesus did and said is true, then death is not the end of the road. My road, your road, anyone's road. And so when Jesus makes this very, very exclusive claim, it is an exclusive claim. And once again, in ways that I didn't think we'd be here this quick, dangerous words today. We live in a world who says everything is valid. We're not too different from the first century. Rome would meet a new god in there when they'd conquer new people, and they would just add this god in the Parthenon, would be one amongst many. And you go in the Parthenon, and Rome would go, look at all these gods. Find the god that's good for you. All are equal. All get to the same place. Go find your truth. Go find your God. Whatever works. Rome said everything is valid. There are many expressions of God. Everything is equal. And so we arrive at 2023, and people say, we are at a new time. We're exploring new ground. This is modern and fresh. We're thinking new. We're thinking so new that we're back to 2,000 years ago again. Exactly the same place. In a time where Gnosticism was once again running rampant. That's for a different sermon. But we're right in the middle of a fully Gnostic philosophical worldview again. Now it says, this is what inclusivity demands. There must be several routes to God. They all must have equal claims. Everything has to be held on the same value. And Jesus stands up and says, if you do not honor the Son, you do not honor the Father. If you do not recognize Jesus, you've not recognized God. This is an exclusive claim and the sticking point. And then someone will say, what about those who've never ever heard? Paul deals with this in Romans chapter 1 and in chapter 2 beautifully. I heard a story of a missionary who said they were, and some of you know, probably have heard of this, there's something called the Jesus Project, and they have projector and the Jesus film, and they'll go into a little native community and they'll set up a screen and they'll show the Jesus film in their language. It tells the story that when they were gone, there was one elderly gentleman that hung around. Everybody else had left, and when they were packing up, he walked up to them and he said, I want to thank you for what you did today. And they said, oh, well, you're welcome. What did we do today? And this man said, I have worshiped this God all my life, but until tonight I didn't know who my God was. There are people who have never heard. Paul says their conscience bearing witness. They walk in all the light that they possibly have. And even though they might not have ever heard the name Jesus, Paul says in Romans, those who have the law will be judged as those who have the law. Those who do not have the law will be judged as those who've never had the law or had the capability of having the law. Which is, God judges us on what we have the capacity to know, not on some standard. But then, how do I know exactly what the standard is? You don't. That's the point. Which is why Jesus says, God says, why don't you leave that up to me? But even those who are judged rightly are judged that way because of the grace and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Not through whatever they're involved with. Even those who have never heard benefit from grace. That's why we call it grace. What about this claim that Jesus is God? If Jesus is God, what does that tell us about God? I think all of us have this idea of God. A lot of us have an idea of God that's informed by stories and the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and John Milton and a whole lot of things, but may not be exactly a biblical view of God. I have told the story before. I have a distinct memory of my mom was there, and I was probably watching a baseball game. I got real engrossed, and all of a sudden I turned around and talked to her, and Mom was gone. And I looked at all through the house. Mom was gone. I looked in the backyard. Mom's gone. The garage. Mom's gone. The front yard. Mom's gone. Mom had just disappeared. And you know what this meant? Jesus had returned, and I'd missed it because I called my brother a pinhead that morning. Which I don't think is fair because not all little brothers were as pinheady as mine was. And I shouldn't get judged because I told the truth about my little brother. She just went next door to Grandma's house. Had this very view of a God that just prowled and waited for me to just have a toe off the line. I'm not sure that's exactly accurate. We talked about this in the summer, last fall, we say God is love. And I wholeheartedly believe that God is love. But when we say God is love, God sets the terms for what is love, not me. Love is wholehearted. Love is complete. Love is committed. Love is sacrificial. Love is not concerned with me. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not self-seeking. Love does keep no record of wrongs. We go on from there. If Jesus is God, then what is God like? Well, God grants us freedom, including the freedom to reject Him. In our creation, God risked rejection. If my daughter had come to me, let's say at age 17, and said, well, Dad, I went on a date last week with that, remember John? Yeah, I remember John. I didn't like him very much. Yeah, well, he keeps calling me. He calls me every day. He sends me nonstop texts. And I tell him I'm not interested. And yet he keeps texting me. And he keeps calling me. And he keeps following me around at school. And he tells people I'm his girlfriend. And I'm tired of it. And I'll say, dear, where is he? I know a place we can hide the body. I wouldn't say that. And I've told him to leave me alone. And he says, no, I'm going to make you love me. We would all say, love that is forced, love that is compelled, is not love. Without freedom to be rejected, without freedom to walk away, it's not love. Love has to be freely chosen. When God grants us freedom, He risks a rejection. He risked us walking away, which a lot of us, most of us, all of us freely have done. So what was God's response to our exercise of our free will? God came to us, Jesus, the Son. What kind of God is this? We still have the Sistine Chapel God in our head. I'm not putting down the Sistine Chapel. Goodness gracious. I do stick figures. That's beautiful. But we have this big enthroned white flowing hair with his finger extended, doing all these things. People in fear underneath. Beautiful picture, but that's kind of still sometimes in our mind. The biblical story is a God who creates and then watches His creation spoil it. Gives us life and then watch us associate with death. So how would He respond to that? As a result, He came to experience the spoiled world that we created and then take all of that anger and pain and spoiledness, and He let us drag Him to a Roman cross. The worst that it gets. He even takes our rejection, our sin, and He looks and in His last breath says, forgive them, they know not what they do. And went to the cross for us. And I know that I'm stealing the headline from 4 weeks from now. But He rose again and asked us to share in that new life. It's a very, very, very exclusive claim. And that's okay. But the exclusive claim calls us to a sacrificial life. That exclusive claim calls us for a different kind of love. And as we go through this Easter, as we look for that new life, I hope that we all will start to think about the demands that this exclusive claim makes on us.